Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the May committee meeting. We have one major item to discuss this morning that Dale will lead us through. And then I have a couple of shorter topics and requests for thoughts from the Finance Committee. So that is the short but important agenda for this morning. So I think people have had a chance to see the minutes from our last meeting, which was a very important meeting and covered a number of different topics. Are there any comments relative to the minutes that haven't already been taken and incorporated into those? Okay, hearing none, I will deem them to have been approved.
I can do a vote.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, so thank you. So just by way of introduction, for many years, or at least in terms of my involvement, we have consistently had very detailed reporting and analysis relative to our major repair and replacement reserve. And it's kind of a doorstop. I think we're up to 600 pages, something like that. So what we're going to review is a report that Dale prepared. And it has, for me, it has two very important attributes. Number one, it underlines the fact that this whole process of determining the adequacy of the reserve and forecasting the ins and outs associated with the reserve is a core responsibility of the association, number one. And number two, what Dale has done is produced a deck that I think is thoughtful, logical, and comprehensive, and that is absorbable by the community. And so that is pretty much a radical change from what we have done over the last several years. And I think it's just excellent progress. So this morning, Dale is going to walk us through this report. What I suggest, Dale, but tell me if you want to do it differently. What I suggest is that maybe you take us through the document first, and then we can entertain questions and circle back to the relevant section.
Sure. And my thought is to maybe pause on each page and just see if there's any thoughts, comments. This is the first time, obviously, that this is being published, so to speak. So not only is its presentation and content, so to speak. So I don't want to necessarily read through every single page, but I presume that each of you have read through this and studied it to a certain extent and can provide comments at each page rather than reading through each page. And I'm playing with this way. So again, a lot of this is all about education. And the first page has somewhat of a conclusion, you know, at the bottom of it there in bold. That's kind of the leave behind message that I think this report should deliver. But again, I'm open on any of this for thoughts and comments to improve and move this forward. So if you have any comments, please just reach out and we'll stop and chat.
And I guess the only color that I've had some experience with other HOAs and community associations, and I think the level of sophistication that we're experiencing here is way higher than the typical HOA, COA. And that is something that is extremely important. If there are community associations that do a better job, I would frankly be a little bit surprised, but I think we're, if not best in class, we're close.
Hey, Paul and Dale, this is my only comment. I think everything's great because we all understand what this is about. Do we still ever really explain why we do a reserve study? You know, a lot of this came out of all the things that happened in Florida and then the importance of doing it and getting it, just making sure we have money for things that go wrong. But I still think we use big words, and I know some of my clients understand even reading this. So, I mean, to me, it's deterioration, there's depreciation. And I think we need to just kind of basically come down and say, what we're doing this because we're basically saving money to kind of compensate for the wear and tear on our existing assets. Or something like that. Does that make sense?
I think it says that on the top of the next page, pretty much. I mean, I agree with the thought process, but I think the next page
Comfortable with that. I'll make sure that we
says it exists to set aside the necessary funds to offset the ongoing daily depreciation of KICA's infrastructure asset.
okay.
So Debbie, it's a good point to emphasize. We didn't, or Dale didn't choose these particular words, and I'm not suggesting he changed the words at all, but I think conceptually, we want to think about this as a user fee. You know, when I live on the island and I use the bridges and I use the sandcastle and I use the roads, I should be paying for my fair share of the cost of those infrastructure assets. I shouldn't be subsidized by future members, which is to say we shouldn't push costs out to the next generation of owners.
Right.
And I shouldn't be getting so there ought to be a concept of fairness embedded here. And I think that's in fact where we're going. But yes, this concept of paying for funding for regular way deterioration is a core tenet of this whole process.
And Paul, so your communications team is online with you listening to this because they're going to publish about the finance committee tomorrow in the newsletter. So they could pull this sentence to Debbie's point to help the membership understand the significance of what you were talking about in your meeting.
Yeah, we spend a lot of money on this, and I think everybody needs to understand why we feel the need to do it.
Sure.
Okay, that's it. Thanks, guys.
So,
I mean, I think you could effectively take the first sentence in this first paragraph and put it as the first sentence on the previous slide, and you're kind of in fact
Yeah, just grabbing it.
that, right? You're basically just starting with here's what it is, and now you go into I think there's probably room on that first slide just to add what is the reserve, similar to what's on the second page.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Again, the first portion of this report is a lot of education and getting an attempt to get readers on the same page to basically what's important, which is the data that follows. So again, if there are any comments on this lead-in, I think a lot of what we will or should be talking about today is the model itself, and how we want to present that. So I'll just keep scrolling.
Yeah, I just real quick, and you saw my comments, so I'm not going to go over them all, but I know, Paul, you also kind of thought maybe under that site and grounds bullet, it needs to have a parentheses beside it that says including bike paths or something like that, just so people, there was, I kind of had a question as to where those were, assuming they were either under roadways or site and grounds, but I think people focus on those bike paths.
Yep, we can do that easy enough.
Will we also be posting the actual report, the 600-page report?
My expectation on that is,
Because we have historically posted that, so it's out there for the last 2 years. Are we gonna, are we moving from that?
so much of that report is detail and confusing to what we're presenting. In other words, they have their revenue and expense model, so to speak, that doesn't really tie into what our actual revenue streams are or our projections are. So at a minimum, that portion of it is very confusing. I would recommend not to. Now, there's one part of it that we could include, which would be the detailed component list. And I have that teed up to be able to do that. That way, in this report, we're talking about just categories. And nowhere do we have a listing in this report that shows street XYZ or drainage specifics. And that component listing with useful life and remaining useful life kind of data would show the detail of the component categories, which may or may not be useful. I leave that open to this group to say, yes, we ought to publish that or post that.
I guess my feeling is as long as we have this report posted and highlighted, I don't think it hurts. I do agree with Dale, though, that the AR report is and can be a little confusing. In particular, their role, which is a critical role, is advising us on remaining useful life and cost to replace. That's the primary focus. The other 600 pages are detailed that are going to be useful to Dale and Jody, but I think it isn't going to be particularly useful to the community. And as Dale just suggested, it sort of implies that they have some stake in the inflow, in the revenue forecasting, and they have nothing to do with that, nothing whatsoever. That's all KICA. I guess my default position would be, unless people say, "Oh my God, I really look forward to reviewing that report every year," I don't think it's particularly necessary.
Hey, Paul, do you think? Oh,
Much
sorry.
In this report, I pulled from that report as an education piece. Michael, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, do you want to put a note that the full report is available upon request?
I think that's fair.
Because I don't want it to be that we're trying to hide anything, but
Yep.
Putting 600 pages out there to somebody to read is just going to cause a whole lot more questions. And your report, your executive summary report is much better than that 600-page report.
Great.
I think that's a good suggestion. Jody, on this page, the general overview, there is one question that maybe you could respond to, and that is, there is an important distinction conceptually between maintenance and major repairs. In the real world, is that distinction clear, or is there often judgment involved between what we think about as maintenance which would not be included under the purview of this reserve, and major repairs, which would be.
I feel like I'm at a Senate hearing. I do not recall.
This is far more accommodating than a Senate hearing, right? These days. There's no shouting at this point anyway.
Not yet.
So to the point of maintenance versus repair, those are definitely two distinct things in the maintenance FM world, the facilities maintenance world. So when we talk about maintenance, we talk about preventative care. When we talk about repair, we're talking about corrective actions. And so what we're looking at with the reserve study is, what is it going to take to replace these assets in the future? While we're doing that, we're trying to extend the life of these assets through a rigorous maintenance program. And I think one of the goals that I have, not that I think, I have a goal to improve our maintenance program through the use of new technology. Right now, we use Salesforce as our database to track many of our assets and whatever work we see needs to be done, but we don't have a rigorous schedule, best practice of when that maintenance, if we're following the manufacturer's recommendations for a particular HVAC unit, for example, we are not necessarily following those guidelines for extending the life. Now, you may see that once we have that program in place, you'll see these useful life numbers extend out a bit. Maybe we'll see a 30% increase in the life.
Hopefully we would.
Right, that would be ideal. And so in addition to getting new technology, we're looking at the skills of our staff and how we can improve the depth and breadth of the skill sets that we have with our engineering department.
Okay, so the answer to my question is maintenance is really important. We're trying to ramp up our game, but it's not confusing to you and your staff what is maintenance and what is major repair.
That is correct.
Okay.
Is there a different accounting treatment for these things? So when he does something he calls a major repair, does that get added to basis in the accounting books, or?
No, it's,
Okay, so that's.
it's expense item, but the differentiation is where the resources come from. So if it's a major repair or replacement, it comes out of the reserve fund and adjustments are made to the useful life type of situation. And if it's just ongoing maintenance, minor, quote unquote, then it comes out of the operating fund.
Yeah, I was, when I started looking at this from a standpoint of members looking at this on that same thing, and we could parse these words all day long, but it is kind of, I think, the clarification that y'all have got in here around differentiation between the reserve fund and the operating fund and the storm fund, that might, maybe there's an opportunity in the back or somewhere to just show kind of, here's a reserve fund, which we clearly show in here, but here's also kind of what the operating fund, what's set aside for 2025, really maybe for normal maintenance expense. And then, what's the storm fund? I just wonder if people are going to ask questions about operating fund and storm fund, and maybe somewhere in the back we could demonstrate what those are. Do you think people know what those are and are familiar with?
Well,
Go ahead.
from my perspective, we could go pretty far with regard to explanations. We talk about,
I agree. You can't go down rabbit holes. So
well, we talk about the operating fund and the storm fund fairly extensively in our quarterly reports, for example, and discuss within the finance committee.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, sure, we could put more into this.
No, like I said, you could turn into an encyclopedia. So I'm fine with that.
Sometimes less is more. But again, I'm open to that thought.
So Dale, I do think the last paragraph here is for sort of the general public, so to speak, we are pretty clear. Normal, ongoing, minor repairs and maintenance are operating costs and are also not paid from the reserve fund.
Yeah,
So-
we're on page 3. Yeah.
Okay,
That's this paragraph right here.
Yeah.
so Dale,
that
one of
works.
and John's earlier comment made me think of it in terms of the categories of equipment and the 600 pages of components. One of the things that has historically a little confusing to me is the work that we do around the ponds and lakes that is eligible for reserve funding and is part of the reserve adequacy process. So I don't know whether you or Dale wants to talk to this, but maybe just a minute on the ponds and lakes stuff, LCI or whatever we call it.
Sure.
Can I take it first?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Jody's like, no, please don't. So this was a covenant amendment vote in 2000 by the membership that allocated a portion of reserve funding to be used for landscape capital improvement, to be used solely for landscape improvement and natural area management. So it says it's included, but not limited to installation of irrigation systems, tree replacements, new installation, removal of invasives, and other such large landscape projects as approved by the board of directors. So, and I know, Paul, you and I have had this conversation in the past. So the way we're distinguishing it is similar to your previous question about maintenance versus a capital project, an infrastructure project that goes to reserve. Our lakes team has their own operating budget in which they manage the ponds on a day-to-day basis. They do water quality testing, they do view window pruning, they do pond edge management, and all of that comes out of their operating budget. However, in 2019, there was a project developed specifically for the lakes as a capital improvement project. The lakes hadn't been overhauled from a vegetation standpoint in decades. And so the project was developed to go lake by lake and do a wholesale upgrade or improvement of the landscape surrounding the pond, cutting back the overgrowth, getting that pond back to a nice healthy edge, and thereby positively influencing our drainage systems because that overgrowth was negatively impacting our drainage system. So it was decided at the time in 2019 that that was a significant enough of a project to go pond by pond to classify it as an LCI project, thereby using reserve funds. Whether the current board agrees with that or not is certainly up for debate, but that's the background of it.
Okay, and then Dale, the follow-on to that helpful description is that in your future expenditure curve, you have estimated future costs associated with that ongoing
As long as
responsibility.
those are included in the component list, yes, and Shannon's shaking her head.
Okay.
Yes, LCI has a allowance account, just a total allowance for LCI annually.
One of
$1,000. I don't
add
remember the number.
is that this is a contracted effort. This isn't the staff going out and doing
Yes.
this. And so the contractor that comes out, they have, larger equipment that we don't keep and maintain. So the scope of the project is much larger. And when we look at the revegetation of the ponds, we're looking at the future. The ponds weren't developed in the way that we think is the best way to manage the ponds. So when we go through and we do these major capital improvements from the landscape perspective for the ponds, it's looking at the future health to maintain it that way. So we can date it.
Right, but if we go to, later in the report, there will be on page 17, which is the underlying component data. Where would the landscape capital improvement, LCI effort, be found on page 17?
Is that site and grounds?
My guess is it's site and grounds, but I'll look it up from the report itself while you guys are moving on. I will get you an exact number.
Okay, but it's in there.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay.
Back to, we were here, we're now moving on. Again, I don't want to explain this too much, because I think you've had an opportunity, but anybody have any comments on this education piece on 5, which is up on the screen? And the key point from my perspective, when we get to the model, is that there's certain components, certain variables that are, I want to say somewhat dictated, and that's the inflation rate, which is dictated by the reserve fund policy. And then the investment return is linked to the inflation rate. So in the model that's published here, we're using the 4.9% 10-year rolling average inflation rate. And the model allows for changing variables to kind of do scenario analysis. But I think for the published report, it's important for us to utilize the variables that are dictated by policy, which is the 4.9%. So that's just kind of background leading into some of these data points.
One of the things when we talk about our differentiated operating account and reserve account, one of the things that I find a little challenging, but I don't really have a good answer for, is that when we look at the reserve account, every year there is either a surplus or a deficit, meaning the inflows and the outflows don't happen to be exactly equal. Now, when that occurs in the operating account, generally speaking, a deficit is not good and a surplus is good. Whereas in the reserve account, when there is a mismatch of revenues and expenditures, that is not necessarily a bad thing, because it would almost be coincidental if in any year the reserve expenditures and the reserve funding were equal. It would just be
Random.
random.
Yeah. Because of the
And
lumpiness of the asset placement. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's just something that all of us need to keep in mind. Dale does actually refer to that in the sort of the penultimate paragraph on page 5. But that is something that all of us just need to keep in mind as and when there are questions from our community. Why are we running a surplus in the reserve account? Well, that happens to be for a calendar year, and the fact that there is a surplus or there is a deficit isn't necessarily a good or bad thing.
Okay, moving on.
So just on page 5, we
Yep.
call this generating sufficient cash.
Yep.
These things seem to me to be more around assessing funding adequacy. So I don't know if that was, I'm suggesting maybe think about the title, but so wordsmithing, not a major comment. But this is an important page because these are the metrics that we think about in terms of assessing how we're progressing, right?
I think this relates back to, yeah, so it,
You can move on, I'm just.
yeah, I tried to categorize these.
Yeah.
I'm open to wordsmithing, trust
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Projecting cash flow, cash balances, again, all pretty straightforward. Any thoughts, comments as we move forward? You know, the upper portion was all about the cash balances generating sufficient cash. Then we move on to the expenditure side, which again, this is where we, as Paul had indicated earlier, this is where we rely significantly on the specialists. We have we direct the specialists. We have a lot of input into useful life and experience, but they have the database that helps us kind of bring this full circle, and we utilize their report to generate the ongoing expenditures over a 30-year period.
Okay, so that touches on another topic that maybe Dale, Jody, we could ask you to comment on. The availability of robust data is, of course, necessary for modern life. What is the state of KICA's database relative to this topic? And what is the state of AR's database for comparable HOAs in comparable parts of the country? And is their database actually accretive to the value of our database? And so where are we in terms of the quality and robustness of the data that we have now and in the future?
I think part of that's specific to when components had been last repaired, replaced, all those types of things.
Absolutely.
So, boy, that's a large question. We are working with Association Reserves and have access to all of the information that we have here. We have access to their database to manipulate and do whatever we need to based on what is reality here. And that's kind of another point towards not posting what they publish, because we have a better sense of the reality of what is happening here on Kiowa Island. And we are not looking at what if scenarios, we're looking at hard data. And I think Dale has done a phenomenal job of painting that picture. So as far as a database that we maintain here, going back to my earlier stated goal, I believe that we need a better database of all of our assets so that we can do, I know there's been questions about back testing. You know, I want to be able to look back historically and say, here on Kiowa, this is the last time we replaced this asset, and this is what we've done to extend the life of this asset. And right now, we really don't have that capability. We have our senior engineer who's been here for 10 years. He is basically our repository for all of the things that have happened in the last 10 years. But I think it's well known that we had a data breach years ago, which did not help with our records. So I think what we need to do is get a system in place that helps us capture and not have a single owner of all of this information, and helps us start really building, even though we can go back years, kind of build that historical picture and then help us develop our plan for the future.
I think it's
I'm not
fragmented the
surprised.
way it is now. And so to Jody's point, trying to bring everything in under one database will help the staff manage it better.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, we can incorporate or download from Association reserves, the data they have over the,
Yes, and we have reserve studies back to the very first one. We know as assets were being replaced or changed, or so we have all of that history.
Yeah, one of the requirements in months in advance of the association reserve team showing up to Kiowa is they ask us to provide all of the data from the previous year. Show us all of the projects that you've undertaken in the last year. Show us the bids that you got. Show us the actual repair costs. So we're building this report even before they arrive on set. And when they do arrive, we look at what are the projects you currently have scheduled and what are the bids that you have for them? Let's look at the engineering. Maybe they could recommend a different way for us to look at things, but that's generally not in their scope, but they are experts in the field as well. Do help us kind of formulate our opinions on some of the projects.
So one of the things that occurs to me, and this is both Jody and Dale, their functions. One of the things that occurs to me is that as we move from year to year and publish our annual reports, it might be good to highlight if there were methodological changes. So if we determine that, to Jody's earlier point, our strategic maintenance framework has extended useful life. Okay, well, that's a change that's going to flow through to the numbers. And so if we could highlight the changes, either positive or negative, associated with those core vectors, useful life, cost to replace, that would be really, really helpful and good for the community to know.
I do agree with that point. It's hard to look at last year's report and this year's published report and see, well, what really did change without going back to the handwritten notes that I have on the draft version, right? So I do want to come up with a way that allows us to see how we're positively impacting the process.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, if you look at page 17, there's probably, if you look at the top 3 or 4, right, those are the ones that are really moving the needle. So I think, when we think about sort of assessing what the consultants provide and where we put our quote finger on the scale to make adjustments, I think, obviously looking at bar area components is not as critical as looking at asphalt roadways, right? So I think you could probably prioritize, where you want to, test the consultant's methodology against our own experience, and focus on, the areas of big expenditures.
Okay.
okay. Again, moving forward, being no other comments on the initial pages.
Just one last thing, Dale, just to confirm, like, do we look at what the consultant provides us, and do we make sort of subjective modifications to what they give us, or do we pretty much go with what they give us? And I'm not making a judgment either way. I'm just curious.
I would say it's done in cooperation, John.
Okay.
Here on site, they spent an inordinate amount of time with Jody and Ryan and their team to talk through that.
Okay, so it is informed by our own subject matter expertise and experience.
Yes, sir. As well as outside specialists, say if we've contracted to look at bridges that year, then we're going to go back and look at what our bridges are timed for in the reserve study.
Great.
So I think, just for perspective, I think Jody was interacting with them throughout his initial tenure, had significant back and forth starting as early as probably December. And then we've probably had, probably 4 or 5 iterations of their report before we utilized it to generate this report. So
got it. Great.
Out of back and forth. And obviously that's all pertaining to the component lists, useful life, all on the, for the most part, the expenditure side.
Great.
Another thing I will add to this is that our contract with Association Reserve is to, it's over a 3-year period, one of which is a site visit. The other 2 are remote. So this year was the site visit, and I think very wisely, Shannon had me meet with them on site this year, even though I think we did it last year. I'm not quite sure. But we went through a whole bunch of these assets by literally walking out to look at the assets and taking pictures and investigating like the engineering reports and what, you know, what are plans for the future, comparing it to their database. Like, it was a lot of work with myself, with Ryan and Evan, Doug, Matt. I mean, we all had a little piece of it. And it's.
You might just want to, again, I don't want to get into details, but maybe on slide 9, you know, in that first thing that where it says we rely on the reserve consultant, maybe it should just imply, you know, indicate that we partner effectively, right? Or something that indicates that there's a great deal of engagement by our team in formulating this. And it's not just like we just take whatever the reserve consultant gives us. There's an implication. Again, I think there's a way to wordsmith that really simply, just to indicate that, you know, we work with the reserve consultant or something to that effect.
In the back of my head, I think that I've indicated that earlier in the report, but
Okay.
I think I oftentimes repeat sentences later because.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, that's just part of.
So on. So I think it would be appropriate to add that here too. So it's a one-stop shop on that piece of information.
Jody, this is an unfair question, and I acknowledge that up front, but are you impressed with our guys at AR?
I am. I really do think that they take this to heart. You know, I think the success of our association is a direct reflection on the success of their business. I had the privilege to attend the CAI conference a couple weeks ago. That's the Community Association Institute. And even though it wasn't the theme of the conference, the overriding message that I came away with was, do not allow your board to get rid of your association reserve study. And it wasn't from association reserve professionals. It was from all the people in the industry who recognize the importance of this study. There is a large and growing list, a blacklist, they call it, of homeowners associations who are being denied insurance coverage. And that means buyers can't come in and buy their condominiums and homes. And so that directly.
Because they don't have a.
Insurance.
Yeah, that was in the press recently. You know, they can't get mortgage insurance either, title or mortgage insurance. So
it is a direct implication for us, right? I think we're doing a fantastic job. It's another reason, just another reason to have this study in place, is that we can respond to our insurance company and say, look, this is what we're doing. We can show to the community, this isn't just a couple of people on staff who are making these things up. This is an industry standard.
Okay, so your thought process, again, in terms of our vendor, our advisors, that they're bringing value to the table that we don't have, experience and knowledge that supplements what we do.
That supplements what we have. And they cast a wider net, right? So they're looking at associations along the Eastern Seaboard.
So just as an aside, I really wonder when people will figure out that when they're buying a unit in any HOA, with an HOA or a COA like ours, I wonder at what point the broker community is going to say, in order for me to do a good job, I need to tell people that there is a reserve in place and whether it is properly funded or not, because now I'm guessing 99% of people who buy condos don't ask that question.
You're right. And it wouldn't surprise me if it becomes law that it has to be disclosed in the future.
Yeah, it is in Florida, I think, already. I mean, obviously, we have no further look than downtown and see what the implications are of, in addition to the Florida situation, what they vacated that condo tower in downtown Charleston a few months ago.
Yeah.
Due to the same problem, failure to maintain it.
Okay.
This,
We
This
talked
is-
a little bit about, I mean, I don't think we need to identify the consultant, right, or their qualifications. I mean, that's,
No,
yeah.
I believe in your policy, it says that we have to have a specialist that's designated as a reserve specialist, which they are.
Yeah.
So there's, in my view, there's two significant aspects of the reserve fund. One is generating sufficient cash to cover the deterioration of the assets or the infrastructure. The other aspect is that doesn't necessarily mean we have sufficient cash on hand at any given point to pay for the actual expenditures. Somewhat related, but not completely. So this is an example of how our cash situation is, the accumulation of cash is covering the usage or the percent of deterioration. And it simply starts with the audited number for reserve fund cash, shows our budgeted sources and uses, our net surplus ending, and the reserve study is always forward looking, right? So it's projected cash as of the beginning of the following year. Their accumulated deterioration figures are as of the beginning of this upcoming year to get to that percentage at the bottom. And I just referred that final row there. That is the percentage as of 1/1/25. I will tell you that figure is a little different from the reserve study in the past, in that I pulled out about $500 and some thousand of annual major repairs, let's say, that aren't necessarily that replacement, component replacement type figures, to come to a actual, as of right now, what is our deterioration? Those other costs are annual, and it's not really replacing assets. So it just affected the percent a little bit, not drastically, but just wanted to make you aware of that.
but Dale, are you saying that the pages on the numbers on page 11, those are the right, the
Yes.
quote-unquote right numbers?
Yes. So I guess my point is further to our discussion with regard to posting the reserve study, their expenditures and this percent funded will be different because they don't acknowledge that $500 and some thousand. And I felt to be accurate with regard to these actual replacement figures that we needed to pull that 500 and change number out of their numbers.
So let me give you an example. It might help crystallize what Dale's referring to. Within the reserve study is money for engineering and design. And we use engineering and design money every year related to surveying, related to design for projects, feasibility of projects, infrastructure inspections. That engineering and design money does come out of reserves. And so Dale has backed that money out because it's not a physical asset that's deteriorating. That money is allocated in your reserve study. It is part of your ongoing every year projects, but in calculating this, he's removed that. Does that make sense?
That's an awesome clarification. Thank you.
Let me just say that back to you, Shannon, because I'm not sure I'm clear on that. So for the project out in the preserve at Cinder Creek, we're having to do design and engineering analysis before we start ordering
And
parts.
permitting, yes. Mhm.
The engineering and design cost, X thousands of dollars, would be funded from the existing MR&R reserve.
Yes, in support of that asset, yes.
And
So
then,
that's contained, yes, sorry.
and then I would, and then consistent with that, in terms of calculating the future cost of replacement of Retz Bluff boat launch, an engineering and design component would be included therein?
Yes, so within the reserve study, you will see engineering and design money that is allocated, I want to say roads, drainage, some of our major infrastructure. But in order to determine this calculation that Dale has on this page, it's also within our budgets. You'll see it, it's separate line items within the reserve budget for engineering and design. But to calculate a deterioration number, a specific deterioration of assets number, he removed a line item of engineering and design from this calculation on page 11. Because
Which
it's
was
not a
basically just
physical asset.
reducing, that's the 7.3 million, right? That's where that came out of. That would have been a use of cash that we didn't reflect.
Yes, and it comes out of the, to David's comment, which you may not have heard, it's comes out of the numerator and the denominator.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
But to the extent that those engineering design costs have to be replicated each time you do the replacement, like 20 years in the future, I'm not sure I understand. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following why you would remove things that you actually spent and things that you're gonna have to spend 10 years from now when you're.
I don't, he's not removing it from future project costs. He's only removing it from this calculation of a deterioration of physical assets.
So this speaks to, if we had to replace that asset today, what is that cost?
Okay, so I think,
And quite honestly, it's $500,000, which doesn't.
Yeah. Let me ask this question, like, let's say Cinder Creek's hard cost, all other costs other than engineering design are, say, $1 million. When that gets done, and let's say there's, $100,000 of E&D. So when it gets completed, does the number become 1.1?
So the way we would do it is we would do the actual construction costs of the 1 million.
Yeah.
E&D is in as an allowance within the
Okay.
reserve study,
Got
not specific to a project.
I got it. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Right.
That makes sense.
In that it's an annual $100,000 that goes to cover.
Yeah, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Any asset. It's not
Yeah, you can't isolate it down to a specific asset. That's the point.
so
Some might require it, some don't.
right.
So Dale, you and I have had a conversation about terminology that I think may be related to this discussion. And historically, I have used the term fully funded or not fully funded. And I appreciate that you think that estimated percent of deterioration funded is a better descriptor. But if this were to say, percentage funded, would the number be a little different? I appreciate that maybe the difference isn't significant, but would it be a different, to David's point, we
It'd be a
know
little lower.
what?
It would be a little bit lower because you would,
Slightly.
Okay,
If you're,
Based on
if
this last
if money
conversation,
is coming
I'm not
out of,
sure.
if money is coming out of the reserve fund, I don't think we ought to be adjusting it's money that we spent, it came out of the reserve fund. I'm not, I haven't thought about this as much as you have, so I don't wanna.
if it's, and I would just expand that, David, if it's money we think we're gonna spend associated with major repair and replacement, and if it's money that we actually do spend that's coming out of the reserve fund, I think it should be in there. And the fact that it's a small number, okay, fine. But that is a core requirement. It's software. It's not tangible assets, but it's a tangible spend. So I guess I agree with John's point. I think it ought to be in conceptually as well as mechanically. I think it should be in there.
It's a
Shannon, do you?
process that I can follow through on.
Shannon, do you feel strongly about that?
So Dale and I reviewed his original list and I felt very strongly about certain assets that he had removed and I had them added back in. But I don't feel strongly about E&D or the things that are left, so I could go either way.
Okay.
Well, let me give you another example of emergency repair allowance that's currently listed. What does that mean? Are we going to spend $100,000 or aren't we? And I think that's what we're trying to pull out so that
Very fringe type line items that may or may not be spent depending on the circumstances of the year.
Well, I'm not, okay. I'm not sure I really understand what the specific item that you're referring to, Jody, but maybe for purposes of this page, if these are expenditures that are associated with the core mission of the repair and replacement, and if that's part of our adequacy calculus, then I would recommend that it be included.
Yeah. So I'll take a look at the list that I took out. Obviously, I took it out for a reason. So if I go back through that and based on your comments, that process doesn't hold merit, I will put them back in. But likewise, if like Jody's example, if that really isn't a cost that is really anticipated, connected to specific assets, then my orientation would be not to add it in. But unless you just want to do it, then I'll do it. That's, I mean.
No,
that's up to you
I
guys.
want you to, obviously, I want you to think about what is consistent with the logic that we discussed here,
Right,
not the specific.
I'll take another
Yeah.
look.
Okay, that's fine.
And Jody's example was a good one. It was better than the E&D because it's even more fringe than the E&D.
Moving on, this,
Can I just ask a question on the prior page with the percentages? Why is that number, the 85.2, why is that different than the 74.2 that was in the report? The report that we,
because that is usually actual dollars. The report is budget anticipated dollars from, this time
we
last
ended up
year,
with more,
and that
more
number
money.
is- yeah.
We ended up with a
Yeah.
lot more money in that, okay.
surplus, less expenditures, that kind of thing.
So then, John had talked about back testing things and we talked about that.
Yeah.
So just the difference, we're actually ended up at the beginning of 25 in,
Better shape in the report.
10% higher percentage of deterioration funded than we thought we would have at this point last year.
Right.
And the principal reason that is that because we collected more money from, you know,
Various sources.
sources, or is it primarily because we spent less, or that we're extending the lives of things and we're not replacing things, or is it a combination of all?
I would say it's a combination of all.
I
of
knew the
above.
answer before I
Yeah.
asked the question,
Yeah, yeah,
so.
It was a
Okay.
combination, and remember, you took in record CTR, highest CTR you ever took in on Kiawah Island last year.
Yeah.
And also, opportunities for savings, you know, if we predict a particular cost and we end up engineering it.
Yep.
Thanks, yeah, that was helpful, thank you.
Again, it's just a pictorial of where we are, and it's reserve fund cash balances compared to accumulated deterioration. And obviously for the first, let's say 15 years or so, we are matched pretty well, right? So the percent of deterioration is good. And then in the outer years, and I highlighted the fact that I in order to get this all on one page, I highlighted jumping in, instead of going annual increments, I jumped to 5-year increments. And it just shows that in the outer years, because of the model and utilizing 4.9% on the expenditure side and having significant expenditures in those years, that that cash relationship tapers off. Now, I will say that, and I believe I say it in the narrative, from my perspective, I wouldn't be concerned about that at all, because the circumstances change over time, and this model is most accurate in the near years, and it gets less accurate as you move out because of those assumptions. 4.9%, although is appropriate for current circumstances, that's a compounding effect that really is seen moving out to those last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't anything for the change in the deck, but I'm just curious, are there specific assets in that green line that drive that? Like, are they longer lived assets that, you know, like that are creating that as well? You know, more expensive assets that don't have a repair need for, you know, until 2040, or is it simply what you described, a model effect?
No, it's higher expenditures. For example, there's years where, and I think,
The years that really drive those, or the expenses that really drive those really high years, are the vehicular bridges.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, right? The bridges. So,
The
you know,
vehicular
it's
bridges
gotta
all
be,
came on,
again,
yeah,
if you go back to 17, it's got to be one of the bigger numbers, right? It's got to either be roadways or bridges, because everything else is relatively small on a
correct.
relative basis. So, you know, again, that's why I think the useful life of a bridge is 20 years. So if we just fixed a bridge, you know, in 2020, you know, we're not expecting that we'll have to fix it again until 2040, and that's what's driving some of that, I think.
Yeah, so your bridges are divided into 3 components. They're your decking, they're your superstructure right under the
Yeah,
decking.
yeah.
And then they're your substructure that's going down into the creek or
The
the
pylons. Yeah.
right. And so they're divided into 3 different components. Useful lives are different based on that.
Yeah.
And 7 of the 8 vehicular bridges that KICA owns came online at the same time.
Yeah.
So that is going to drive specific years very high. Vehicular bridges is one of the things that we do regular inspections on, and we dive those bridges because we want to make sure that we are taking care of any immediate problems on those bridges to continue to extend the life of that, particularly that substructure.
Yep. Okay.
John,
that's what I thought.
Yes,
this
sir.
screen shows what you were talking about. You can see in 2035, there's an uptick in expenditures, right? That's that green line.
Yeah.
And you can see, so the model is that when there's a large expenditure in one year, it's the cash balance for the next year that decreases. So The blue line is the beginning cash. So in
Yeah.
2035, we had a very large expenditure that then creates the downtick in the cash balance the next year.
Right.
Then you can see in 2050, which is where that separation occurred in the percent deterioration in the cash balance. There's an even larger expenditure there that creates the cash balance decrease in the following year.
Yep.
So an observation, and everybody who's known me for a while knows that this is my hobby horse, but it bears repeating. One of the profound comments that you'll actually find in the AR report is that, and I forget exactly how they say it, but they reference the fact that a funding level in excess of 100% could be appropriate. And I thought that was a very interesting observation. In our situation, in our circumstance, our revenue stream is, and Dale refers to this in his document here, our revenue stream has 3 or 4 major components. Some of those components are highly predictable. And let's say assessment would be in that category. Some of our revenue is not so highly predictable, and CTR would be example of that. And so if you this is not a recommendation, it's not even a bias, but if you have a circumstance where your funding mechanic, your funding inflows are subject to volatility, that could be a circumstance where a funding level is greater than 100%. Again, I'm not suggesting that is something that we should do, but it is a fact of life relative to KICA that CTR in particular is dependent on market forces over which we have virtually no control. That being property values and turnover of property. So that's just something to bear in mind. It is comforting to me that in the near term here, again, in my vernacular, it appears that our funding level is at or around 100%.
Could we run on this graph a right-hand axis that is just the funding level that is on page 14? Right? You know what I'm saying? Like, because it is the case that the funding level is always, in all of these years, except for the out years, we're over 100%. And even in 2040, we're at,
Well,
I mean, I guess if the lines are on top of each other,
The blue-
that implies that the funding level is 100%.
That's the way I interpret it.
But
the blue is our funding level, right?
I just meant the percentage funded, the cash percentage is percentage, like the metric that you're targeting people, like when their lines are on top of each other, that implies that they're 100%, but you could just run the percentage as a axis on the right, and then you can get all that on the same page. Because you take a lot of comfort that you're essentially at 100%.
Right.
I think we are taking a lot of comfort.
Okay.
I wanted to add to your point, Paul, that, the percentage for the CTR, that is a constant. I think I've heard this committee discuss before about the board's ability to alter what that percentage is to accommodate any changes in the market. So I just wanted to make sure that didn't get lost.
No, that's a great point, Jody. And one of the things that I'm thinking about that Dale and I had a chance to chat about is understanding sort of based on our governing documents, what are the opportunities and constraints that impact our revenue sources? You know, what can we do? What can't we do without going to the membership for a covenant change sort of thing? And certainly the 0.5% transaction fee is a great example of that. But we couldn't just say, yep, it's 0.75 without, you know, a lot of brain damage. Okay, thank you.
In the model, just for perspective, assessments are increasing. So the philosophy of the board and the finance committee to date recently, let's say over the last couple of years, has been the philosophy of increasing rates, and this is commercial access fees, assessments, so forth, increasing to keep pace with inflation. So in this model, assessments and access fees are increasing at that same 4.9% that is utilized as the inflation rate. So I guess a leave behind, and I think I've said this in the deck, it's important to maintain that philosophy in that the revenue streams here are dependent upon that in order to keep this percent funded at a level that we desire. So I guess it's support for the fact that, hey, we're raising assessments 4.9% or 3% or whatever the case be. And this is one of the reasons why.
Can I just make the distinction that you're forecasting out a 4.9% increase in revenue, not necessarily increasing the cost of a particular like commercial access fee is going to raise 4.9%. Maybe we make up that delta in increased commercial traffic, for example.
Well, I mean,
That's possible.
that is a level of sophistication that is implicit. You know, when the development cycle tops out, which it will do in the next single digit number of years, will the commercial traffic go down? So I mean, as we become more sophisticated in terms of our modeling, we're going to pick up relationships like that.
Okay. Definitions, and this has to do more with do we have sufficient cash on hand for the expected expenditures? And that's where this model comes into play. I do have, so this is a summary view, right? What I think might be useful is this is the detailed view to that, which just for the most part, line items the revenue side. And you've seen this before, prior meetings. The variables are up top, you know, assessment rate increase, average portfolio return, inflation assumption, and then there's on the revenue side, there's Ocean Pines and West End that are anticipated in future years. And that explains how those are accounted for. And then CTR, similar type of explanation. So this is useful for just more of a detailed view from what was in the report. And as I mentioned earlier, if I change any of the variables above that 4.9%, that automatically changes everything within the model for revenue. But as I mentioned earlier, because of the investment policy statement and the reserve fund policy, I think for the report purposes, I think it's important for us to use that 4.9%. But as far as driving scenarios and that type of thing, not here today within this is a PDF. I could change those variables and see what that impact is.
Right, so this is the model.
This is the.
This is the model. Okay, so just for purposes of clarification, and I'm on page 14, if you could just cycle back to that for a second. So is this a true statement that the incoming cash line is owned by Dale and the outgoing cash line is owned by Jody?
Yeah, I mean,
I think we all.
collaboration
Yeah.
and.
No, no,
And the
of course,
reserve.
Yeah.
of course, but
Yeah.
functionally, the revenue component is something that Dale, understands and is going to forecast. And operationally,
Yeah, so for perspective, I mean, Jody and I collaborate pretty closely on the component process. He is by far a higher, much higher percentage of that day-to-day interaction because of obviously his position and all that, but we collaborate in finalizing the reserve study report from AR that is incorporated into here. But on a day-to-day basis, absolutely, Jody is the guy.
praise the Lord.
Okay,
So,
Any-
so
yeah,
just
thank you.
on the incoming cash side, just the way to, on your other spreadsheet, it looked like the assessment piece of that $7 to $8 million of revenue, the piece that relates to assessments is a couple, 2 million,
it's up there now. It's, as of
So
2026, it's 2.2, 2.3 million.
So it would be the case that over time, as CTR might decline, or as commercial traffic might decline, that the assessment, which is a relatively small component of the overall $7 to $8 million, that if those items declined, that they would have to be made up by the assessment.
That would.
Well,
be-
either that or the increase in the property fee.
Right, that would be an option, yes.
Okay.
I
Now,
mean, and that's why, we had a little discussion about this a while, last year, a little bit or earlier this year. It was like, that was what I was trying to understand, David, is like, what's the vulnerability, if you will, to property sales, right? Or any other large sources here. And so is 2 million, the right number to project out? And obviously Dale has done a lot of work around thinking through the CTR number, and I guess like the Cape was a big kind of mover. Then I think the other two condo deals, you built those in too, right? In 28 and 27. So I think there's, to your point, there's where we have some quote vulnerability is associated with effectively property sales. Commercial access fees, I guess, how do you think about that? Like, as the island gets more and more built out, is that where the access fee number could drop as fewer contractors cross through the gates? Is that the right way to think about that?
So let me give you my thought on that. I think it's a good question, and I think the answer is actually more complex than the development cycle. Because there's another cycle that has already begun, and it's called the tear down cycle.
Yeah, the renovation. Yeah.
And-
No,
and
there's huge, there's a
renovation.
huge pent-up demand for that.
The oldest generation housing stock is, I don't know, 40.
50 at least.
50 years old, something. And so it is, I think it's fair to say, John, to your point, that is a vulnerability, but we need to give, and that's part of our job here, frankly, our collective job. We need to think about, okay, what are the vectors, pro or con, The one we haven't talked about, but we need to talk about carefully, and it's not part of our agenda today, is the investment pool. It probably is true. It probably is true that if we're in an economic environment where property values decline, equity values may also decline. So there are various pieces that are correlated or uncorrelated, and that is a level of sophistication that we need to work together on to incorporate as we continue to step up our game here.
I'd also like to add that, you know, as more and more homes are coming online, I mean, we have 139 new home permits currently out right now. That's more transactions that can occur even if they're finished, right? We're bringing more and more homes onto the island. Additionally,
More transactions, more assessments.
that's right.
Yeah.
And as to the assessment alone increasing if commercial traffic were to decrease, for example, you know, we are, I remember how adamant you were, Paul, about if the assessment goes up, commercial access is going up. We're not putting this all on the homeowners. And so there was a lot of work done last week or last year around the commercial access fees. We're also looking at other ways to generate revenue, anticipating the board is going through a review of our current access policies now, and what of those folks who are coming through the gate could subsidize the commercial access fees. So there's a lot of work still being done there too.
Amen.
So I think the most important topic in this regard is affirming for this model the revenue projections. And my view on this is I try to make this as conservative as possible while anticipating things that we know. If you look at the contributions to reserve, you can see once the new developments come on board, I've taken that down to $1.5 million, just again, to leave more upside than downside in the model, right? And then same with commercial access fees, took it down to $2 million. And what's changing in the assessments and investment income is simply, in the future years, is simply that 4.9% component. So my hope is that we can affirm that, you know what, we can fiddle with these numbers all we want, but is this a conservative approach that we then adjust year to year and move forward with information as we get it?
There was one other point I meant to make. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of bragging, and this is how we can impact, my department impacts the incoming part, is we've done a lot of investment in infrastructure technology, and we're working on our enforcement through security. And if you think about the number of people who come through the gate who might not be paying that fee that they're supposed to be paying, we reported this out in our April board meeting, for Q1, a 28% increase in commercial access fees. That's a $3 million line item. So, you know, we're talking about $750,000 in additional revenue from additional enforcement actions.
And we're not done.
And we're not done.
Yeah, that's great.
Everybody,
Was that your way of, John, was that you?
Yeah, that's Daisy.
So Dale, could we, and this is not about wording, but I agree with what you just said in terms of the focus on the revenue. Could we add, when we go to the board, could we add a page or a slide that says, that articulates the key assumptions, just sort of list the key assumptions that are the key drivers in the near term and out years?
and also you could add the color that you just provided on the elements of conservatism that you applied in the model around those assumptions.
Are you,
Does this,
you're on
serve
page
this
13. You're gonna say, hey, it's already here.
well, to some extent, now if we need to elaborate,
I think it would be helpful if we
Yeah,
got as specific as we could. Is for the board and the community to know that, look at, these are our best ideas, our best thoughts, trying to be conservative to create this model, and it's not static. We're going to be constantly reviewing these assumptions as facts and circumstances change in the world around us. I think that would be, that would add focus to how critical those assumptions are.
And Paul, I agree with you. I think one of the things that I was looking at this, maybe one of the underlying tenets of this is to say, we're trying to avoid surprises of special assessments to the community. And this is why we're taking this conservative approach, so that we're trying to tie all the loose ends in so that you are not surprised by anything that goes on.
okay.
Excellent.
So, moving on, I think we looked at this page, which is 15. I don't know if there's any further. I talked about it a bit earlier. And then underlying data. And again, I think we talked about this too, but I thought it was important to look at the significance of each category based on replacement costs, and then also based on current status with regard to cumulative deterioration. I think it's just perspective. And then the weighted average middle columns are simply, as a category, this is kind of where we are within the overall life cycle of that category, which, again, it's just perspective. It's not, no action can be taken based off of that.
Okay, so I promised Paul an answer on this page, so I did my homework while I was sitting here. And so LCI is contained within the site and grounds number. And the site and grounds number is $312,500. Compare that to the 2025 budget, which is currently $275,000.
Okay. What is guardrails?
Guardrails, we have guardrails on our overpasses on the like on the 3 overpasses on the parkway. We have guardrails on our vehicular bridges. Guardrails. Vehicular guardrails.
Like you drive down the highway, you have the metal rails along the side of the road, you can run and catch.
You don't remember seeing any guardrails?
No. Well, there are guardrails. When I cross a wooden bridge, there are guardrails, keep you from going into the pond. Is that a guardrail?
You're welcome.
It is a guardrail. Yes, sir.
But
Yeah.
why isn't it part of vehicular bridges?
Well, so it is, that's probably not a good example, but there are other guardrails along the roads in areas that are not bridges.
Okay.
Those guardrails on the bridges would be considered
Okay.
part of the
All right.
superstructure.
Fair
So
enough.
if you think about Keel Island Parkway, you go over 3 golf course tunnels as you're driving the Keel Island Parkway. And there are guardrails there as well, so that you don't go off the edge and land in the golf course.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then, honestly, you can tell me whether they're useful or not, but people tend to like pie charts, so I threw these in there, whether they serve a real purpose or not. That's, from my perspective, debatable, but there's no harm in keeping them in there.
Agreed.
yeah.
Hey, Dale, I like those a lot. The one thing I would just question, I take it you're pulling this data from the report and just synthesizing it in a different manner. do you want to cite the fact that you're pulling it from the report so that it's not something that is just coming from us, it's coming from a third party?
Um,
Yep,
yeah,
you just put a source on there.
well, this isn't, well, the chart, the table itself or the chart itself is I generate based off of this data up here. So it's, I didn't,
But that data came from the report, right?
what's that?
That data came from the report.
This data did.
Why don't, maybe putting another asterisk at the bottom saying from the report, the air report. And that way the rest of it just flows that it is from an underlying source of data that was not generated by internally or by the key court.
These are the pages that has the expenditure data,
Yes, that's what I was
Yeah,
thinking.
Are the pie charts just a different reflection of the slide 17?
yes.
Yeah, I would just
I'm
put,
not even sure you
the
need them.
notation on the slide 17. That's what I was
Yeah,
thinking.
either that or I'm not, I mean,
I can put a footnote on each of the component listings and or expenditures that indicates source. That's a good comment. Thank you.
Okay.
That's,
Okay, I had, based on a conversation that I had with Dale yesterday, I came up with a list of questions that were more Jody related, but I think we have, such as back testing, and I think we have touched on each of those.
Dale, given this, how much educational stuff and how clearly this is all laid out, last year we had put together some sort of guideline or something that we put out around how to read and how to interpret the report, the reserve study. Do we need that anymore?
oh, what's posted on the web?
Yeah, the guideline.
I mean, that might be a good point.
So I found this to be
Yeah,
better, even though
I
I was
remember we
involved in the
worked-
other one, I found this to be actually as good or better in some situations. So, and at the risk of taking stuff down, I'm not sure they're both necessary.
I mean, if we're not going to post the reserve study, right, then how to read the reserve study wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
So,
Fair enough.
That's good. Thank you.
so David, one of the add-ons that I wanted to discuss is that I created an FAQ about the reserve and the reserve process. I've gotten some input from Dale and I've tweaked it. But what I would like to do, to your point, I do think that the report that Dale has constructed, that staff has constructed, is very helpful and 100% better than what we had in the past. So I'm going to send to the committee members the current information.
Yeah, if you don't mind, but if not, we can do it. Okay.
Of an FAQ around the process and around the nomenclature and so on and so forth. So take a look at that, everybody. And if you think it's redundant or even confusing, that's fine. I won't be offended. And if you think it's helpful, but you think it ought to be tweaked, that would also be good. But I did create an FAQ that might be a useful tool for the membership. We did it for the amendment process. I think it was helpful. So anyway, I'll send that around.
That is a little bit of what the guideline was. Did you look at the guideline document when you put together your FAQ?
No,
So maybe you can just send that, and if there's anything valuable, we shouldn't have both those things.
Yeah.
It's
It's on the website, but I'm happy to send it to you.
all right, that'd be a good reminder for me. Okay.
Yeah, I kind of just did a high level, real simplistic kind of conceptual concept on an individual asset that just showed here's the useful life, here's the replacement cost, here's the amortization, and here's what we're trying to achieve. Because I do think some people might not be accountants or that sophisticated, and they're going to. So anyway, I'll send it. You guys can decide if you want to use it or not. Maybe it's in the fact, but it's basically just $1 million asset, 5-year average life. Here's the depreciation, here's the inflation rate, and here's our reserve fund goal, that we effectively match depreciation in terms of reserve fund funding every year, so that at the end of that, when we replace it, we have 100% of the dollars we need to replace it. That's the simple concept of the reserve fund, right? And sometimes I think people get kind of confused by some of the terminology, but I think this is fantastic. I think it's really great work, and appreciate staff for taking the time to put all this together. And I do think, Paul, the facts are going to be helpful too, because there'll be different levels of sophistication in terms of these types of things, and so I think it's good to have that at the ready as well.
I agree with your point, John, that not everybody is an accountant, and I can't remember at this point when it first comes up on the website and people start looking at it, what are they going to see? And I think there should be sort of like a report card or an endorsement by the committee that says, I know just by the fact that you've posted this level of detail, they're saying, okay, well, something must be going right, but perhaps kind of a introduction that says this has been reviewed by the committee. We feel like.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, right? We should, whenever, if this has kind of come out after we've approved it, then I think putting in the deck that we have approved it and we vetted it, and here's the minutes of the meeting, today, I think that would be helpful too. It just lends credibility, to what they're seeing.
I agree. I think that's a good idea to have a preface. We would certainly make that representation verbally when this goes to the board, but I think it's a good idea to have that be a preamble to what we post.
I think it's really good. The one thing I would add is you're thinking about how to put this information on the web is the information that David referred to that was an overview was helpful for what will now be archived 24 and 25 reserve studies, or 24 and 23. And I think you might think about, putting out current year reserve report with all of these documents you're talking about all grouped together, and then maybe a link to prior years, because there may be people who want to go look at, what was it we were projecting 2 years ago? How did that work out? They might want to do their own thing. And I think you might just make it easier to kind of group together what the current things are. I think most of the people who are going to look at this are going to be very grateful for this document that Dale has done and the information that's in there and the FAQ that you're talking about, Paul. But there may be some people who are looking for prior year stuff for comparison's sake.
What is the group's orientation with regard to anything from the actual association reserves report? We talked about the possibility of including the actual component list. Did we come to any conclusion to do that or not do that, or any thoughts?
I guess let me just jump in and say, since it had been our practice for the last several years, I think maybe it would be, and to Mary Ann's point, I think it would be good, at least for the time being, to have the AR report on the website for availability of people who are interested in looking at it. It has more detail than anyone could ever want. But again, this idea of a preface should be carefully worded such that it makes clear that, this was a technical advisor report the report that Dale has issued, that's the KICA report. And there may be differences, but those differences were carefully considered, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of having a robust archive that's available to the member, I think I'm in favor of that. It doesn't cost us much, if anything, and it would avoid any suspicion that might be out there.
May I offer an option?
Of course, of course.
My thought is archiving or making available prior years, I'm fine with. With regard to this current report, I would like to strongly encourage only including the component list, not the rest of it, because I feel like there are community members that will make it a purpose to compare the two, criticize what's in this but not in that, or wait. Anyway, I think you get my drift. I think the actual component listing that shows useful life and remaining useful life can be additive to this report. Anything beyond that would be a negative or not a positive.
I agree with you 100%, and that it actually directly contradicts what you have done because it's based on assumptions. And so it's just going to raise more questions to see, well, why did you predict this in one
On the
report and
revenue
something
side,
completely different?
Right, this is all about the revenue.
Right,
side.
but they're
that-
intertwined.
So we're not using their report to project our revenues.
At all.
We're using, right, and so I understand that. Listen, I think in terms of transparency, we have I think I'm just gonna repeat exactly what you just said. I think we have historically posted the whole report. It was always an issue on the revenue side, that the percentage number that showed up there really wasn't what we thought, right? Because they don't have any, the guy that, what you said about, you're the expert on the revenues, right? That is the case. You have a better view and perspective on revenue. So I know that that report will show a different percentage, but I think in this overview or preface or whatever we call that document, we can just say, look, we use this report for their expertise on the assets and their useful life and their database. And that's what we use them for. They do not have any expertise in our revenue base, our assessments, our, any of that other stuff. And so, that's why this report is so good, because this is what was missing last year, which is the revenue part of that report really wasn't, and that's part of the reason why that 74% number was really 85, right? Once you actually, and in the future, the revenue, the percent funding percentage are actually better than they would project because your projections on revenues are so much better. So I wouldn't be hiding behind. I mean, I understand that you're going to get questions, and I understand that, but I think we have a historical precedent of posting this thing, and I think we should probably continue it, and we'll just have to explain what parts of that report we use and where that they're experts and what part we don't use and where you're the expert.
I with all due respect, Dale, I agree with David. I think, I don't know that in the future we need to publish the non-relevant sections of the AR report, because in the future, maybe the AR report will only focus on the stuff where they actually have expertise and relevance. But for now, I think we can put a health warning in this preamble page or paragraph that says to people, look at, historically, the AR report had revenue projections. We're not doing that anymore. These are KICA revenue, and maybe they were in the past. I don't want to make that too sharp a distinction, but the consultant is advising Jody on the following things. but the entirety of this report is a KICA generated, KICA managed report. So I think, and
We're
you're
fine.
right, you're right to highlight that of our 4,000 homes, there are a lot of skeptical people, and that's not a terrible thing, by the way. People are entitled to be skeptical, but I think we can handle it.
Well,
That's-
Dale, I think if you start getting inundated with questions, it's appropriate for you to come back to the committee, right? And we should potentially figure out the right way to address that. Like if there are a bunch of questions, it shouldn't be all your burden, to address. The finance committee should try to step in again, try to anticipate via Paul's concept of frequently asked questions. But if you are starting to get a lot, then I would inform the finance committee and we can try to help figure out the best way to address it.
No problem. I appreciate the guidance and we'll implement. And I would say based on some of the tweaks, and I'm not sure this will be ready for this week, Shannon, since the newsletter and all that, I'm thinking potentially that this would be posted next week. Or do we want to wait until after the board accepts it?
No, sorry. My view is that it should go as soon as it's ready. We should put it out there. Again, this is still, until the board use it and acceptance is still a draft. They may want to change stuff, but I would want to put it out. This is a very, very important piece of work for the community. And the more time we give the community to absorb it, like it, not like it, criticize it, whatever, the better. So I would put it out as a pre-board review document that we intend to present to the board.
So what's the timing of the board meeting?
Yeah, so luckily Finance Committee is timed well with board meetings. So the board meeting is June the 2nd. What we could do is have Emily, who is online with us right now from our communications team, we have her pull the current finance section off the news department and schedule that to go next week. So we'll do your video, we'll do your report, we'll highlight the finance committee in the discussion and have your report in one section, but then it will also be included as part of board materials. So if somebody's looking at the finance committee because they really love the stuff you do, they see it. If they're looking at the board materials, they'll see it there as well. How about that?
Works for me.
Yeah, I was just trying to make sure you guys aren't going to get jammed, trying to put something together, make all these edits, in a really short period of time.
If Dale has to do it today, it will be a really short period of time. But
Yeah.
if Paul, you're okay with holding off to next Friday, then we should be good.
I am okay with that. And that will give us, and I'm happy to be a contributor to the preamble draft.
And Emily just said she's heard and she's making the adjustments to the newsletter as we speak.
Okay, we're almost done in terms of my agenda today. Dale, I do want to say, and Jody and Shannon, I just think this is a step function change in terms of our critical analysis and reporting for a critical part of the responsibility that KICA has. So thank you for that. Our next meeting is on, Ellen, help me here, the 23rd.
Monday.
Monday, the 23rd. Now, full disclosure, it's on a Monday because of my schedule, and I apologize for that. We don't have a formal agenda. If we have nothing to talk about, we won't have a meeting, but I'd like to keep that as a placeholder. And the last thing that I would like to ask the committee members is the following. I think there may be issues that we should prioritize for discussion for the next 12 months. And there's a whole range of issues that could be relevant in terms of doing the best job we can to advise and assist staff in terms of managing our finances, our balance sheet, our income statement, our reserves, our investing, etc. So I would like you to give some thought to what are the, and I'm absolutely including staff in this. I'd like you to give some thought to what are the initiatives that we might consider as a committee that would improve the quality of our process. So I'll give you for an example. Should we think about what is a recession model? If we have a repeat of 2008, God forbid, in the next X years, what is the impact of that going to be? That's just an idea of something that we might consider expending some brain power on to consider. Another item that I happen to be in favor of, but it's not universal by any means, is the concept of a controls audit. Dale and I talked about this yesterday. I think it's something we should consider, underline consider. The town is doing a controls audit. And actually, I think Dale has done some homework on this, but that is something that we should, and I'm just giving these as an example of items that we might consider for the finance committee to work on, think about, debate, decide, recommend, that that might be helpful in terms of moving the ball forward. So give that some thought. I will try to share some ideas with you more concretely. I will also work on the preamble, and I will circulate to you the FAQ document for your review and consideration. Don't be shy about, feedback. I would just open it up to the committee for any other thoughts before we conclude. Dale, anything from you?
No, good. I appreciate the discussion today.
Shannon or Jody? I move to conclude this very constructive meeting. All in favor? Okay, we're concluded. Thanks very much, guys.